When the heavy iron door of the Cascade Mountain cabin finally gave way, the stale air of 1948 rushed out. Mary, shivering in a borrowed coat with her young son clutching her leg, expected to find rotting wood. Instead, she found the exact reason her family had been running for decades. The heater in the 1998 Honda Civic had finally given out around 2 a.m. Mary Foster pulled the thin, scratchy wool blanket tighter around her 7-year-old son, Leandro, whose rhythmic breathing was the only sound keeping her tethered to sanity. It was mid-November in Seattle, and the damp cold was the kind that seeped directly into your bones. They were parked behind a defunct strip mall on Aurora Avenue, a spot Mary had carefully chosen because the streetlights were burnt out, keeping them hidden from the police and the neighborhood security patrols. Mary hadn't always been here. 2 years ago, she had a modest apartment, a job as a paralegal, and a life that, while quiet, was safe. But when Leandro was diagnosed with a severe, chronic respiratory condition, the medical bills piled up with terrifying speed. Between the missed shifts to take him to specialists and the aggressive collection agencies, the safety net unraveled. First went the apartment. Then went her pride. For the last 6 months, this cramped, rust-flecked sedan had been their entire world. She rubbed her hands together, staring at the frost forming on the inside of the windshield. She had exactly $14.30 to her name. It wasn't enough for a motel. It barely covered a day's worth of food. At 6:15 a.m., a sharp rap on the driver's side window made Mary's heart slam into her ribs. She instinctively threw an arm over Leandro. Outside stood a tall man in a heavy charcoal overcoat. He wasn't a police officer. He held a leather briefcase and had the weary, weathered face of someone who delivered bad news for a living. Mary cracked the window just a fraction. "We're leaving," she said quickly, her voice raspy from the cold. "Just give me a minute to start the engine." "Mary Foster?" the man asked. His voice was shockingly gentle. She froze. Nobody out here knew her name. "Who are you?" "My name is Kenneth Bronson. I'm an investigator working on behalf of Gallagher & Cohen, a probate law firm downtown. I've been looking for you for 3 weeks, Ms. Foster." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. "I know this is highly unusual, and I apologize for the intrusion, but it is imperative that you come to our office today. It concerns your grandfather." Mary stared at the envelope through the crack in the glass. "My grandfather? Harrison Collins died before I was born. My mother told me he walked out on the family in the late 40s. "He didn't walk out, Ms. Foster," Kenneth replied quietly, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "He disappeared. And 3 weeks ago, we received legal authorization to unseal his final testament. You are his sole living heir." 4 hours later, Mary and Leandro sat in a mahogany-paneled conference room on the 42nd floor of a downtown high-rise. The contrast between the plush leather chairs and Mary's worn, thrift store coat made her acutely uncomfortable. Leandro was busy eating complimentary shortbread cookies, oblivious to the gravity of the room. Richard Gallagher, a senior partner with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, slid a heavy, yellowed file across the table. "Your grandfather, Harrison Collins, was a complex man," Gallagher began, folding his hands. "He was an engineer contracted by the War Department during the Second World War. In 1948, he vanished without a trace. Legally, he was declared dead in 1955. However, before his disappearance, he prepaid a 90-year retainer to this firm, along with strict instructions." Mary frowned, pulling the file closer. "Instructions for what?" "To hold the deed to his property until the year 2025, or until his next of kin was located and in dire need, Gallagher explained, leaning forward. Mr. Bronson informed me of your current living situation. The parameters of the trust have been met. What property? Mary asked, her pulse quickening. A house. A cabin, Gallagher corrected. A sprawling, reinforced timber estate deep in the Cascade Mountains, near the town of Skycomish. It sits on 40 acres of private gated land. He handed her a heavy iron key, its edges dark with age. Ms. Foster, the cabin has been completely sealed since November 12th, 1948. We have paid the property taxes anonymously for decades. No one has set foot inside since your grandfather locked the door. It is now yours, free and clear, along with a small stipend to help you get settled. Mary looked down at the key. It was cold and impossibly heavy. She looked at Leandro, who had frosting on his nose. A house, a real roof, a place where they could be safe, where she wouldn't have to sleep with one eye open, terrified of a flashlight shining into a car. There is one condition, Gallagher said, his tone suddenly dropping an octave. Your grandfather left a letter specifically for whoever opened the cabin. He stipulated that whatever you find inside, you must not involve the authorities. Ever. The drive up Highway 2 into the Cascades was treacherous. The stipend Gallagher had provided allowed Mary to fill the Civic's gas tank, buy a set of snow tires, and pack the trunk with groceries, heavy blankets, and flashlights. But as they wound higher into the mountains, the sleet turned to thick, driving snow. According to the map Gallagher had provided, the turnoff to the Collins estate wasn't even marked on modern GPS. It was a forgotten logging road, hidden behind a dense wall of towering Douglas firs. When they finally found the dirt path, the Honda struggled to grip the icy incline. They drove for 2 miles in complete, suffocating isolation. There was no cell service up here, just the howling wind and the crunch of tires on frozen mud. Finally, the trees broke, revealing a clearing. Mary slammed on the brakes. Leandro gasped from the back seat. The cabin was not the quaint, rustic hunting lodge Mary had pictured. It was massive, a 2-story structure built from enormous, dark timber. But that wasn't what made her breath catch. The entire perimeter of the house was heavily fortified. The windows on the ground floor were covered with thick, rusted iron shutters. The front porch was reinforced with steel beams. It didn't look like a vacation home. It looked like a bunker. "Mummy, it looks scary," Leandro whispered, clutching his stuffed bear. "It's just old, baby," Mary lied, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's going to be an adventure." She parked the car and stepped out into the biting cold. The silence of the forest was absolute, almost oppressive. She walked up the wooden steps, which groaned ominously under her weight. The front door was made of solid, reinforced oak. Across the center of the door, a massive logging chain was wrapped securely, held together by a colossal, rusted padlock. Mary took the heavy iron key Gallagher had given her. Her hands were shaking. She slid the key into the padlock. For a terrifying second, it wouldn't turn. The internal mechanisms were seized with 70 years of rust and winter ice. She took a deep breath, gripped the lock with both hands, and forced the key with all her might. With a sharp, metallic crack that echoed through the empty woods, the lock gave way. Mary pulled the heavy chains off, letting them crash onto the porch. She pushed the iron handle down and leaned her shoulder against the wood. The hinges shrieked in protest, but the door slowly swung inward. The smell hit her first. It wasn't the smell of rot or mold, which she had fully expected. It was the scent of dry dust, old paper, engine oil, and stale tobacco. It smelled like a moment perfectly frozen in time. She clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Leandro huddled closely behind her, holding on to the back of her coat. The living room was vast. Furniture from the 1940s was covered in thick, white canvas sheets that had yellowed over the decades. In the center of the room sat a heavy oak desk. The flashlight beam caught the details. An antique rotary phone, an ashtray with the stub of a cigar still sitting in it, and a copy of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, dated November 11th, 1948. The headline read, "Truman declares election victory." It was a perfect, undisturbed time capsule. "Wow," Leandro breathed, stepping past her to look at an old, dust-covered globe in the corner. "Don't touch anything yet, Leandro," Mary warned softly. She moved further into the room. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the iron shutters, she noticed something strange about the layout of the cabin. The wall behind the grand stone fireplace looked off. The wooden panels were mismatched, and the dust on the floor near the hearth seemed to gather in a distinct, rectangular pattern. She walked over to the desk. Sitting right on top of the 1948 newspaper was a small, black leather journal. It was the only thing in the room not covered in a thick layer of dust, as if the airtight seal of the cabin had miraculously preserved it. Mary opened the first page. The handwriting was sharp, urgent, and erratic. November 12th, 1948. They are coming. I don't have much time. If you are reading this, I am dead, and the world has forgotten what I built. Do not trust anyone who comes looking for the schematics. Do not trust the government. The floorboards beneath the rug hold the key to the empire they tried to steal from me. Protect it. Mary's blood ran cold. She looked over at the massive, faded Persian rug sitting in front of the fireplace. She set the flashlight down on the desk, grabbed the edge of the heavy, dust-choked rug, and pulled it back. The air filled with a cloud of grey particles, making her cough. Beneath the rug, the wooden floorboards were different. They were secured with modern-looking, heavy-duty latches that looked entirely out of place for 1948. She knelt down and unfastened the latches. They snapped back with a heavy, spring-loaded sound. Taking a deep breath, Mary lifted the heavy wooden trapdoor. She aimed the flashlight down into the dark cavity below. Mary gasped, dropping the journal. What she saw hidden beneath the floorboards was so staggering, so completely impossible, that for a moment she forgot how to breathe. The beam of Mari's flashlight cut through the suffocating darkness beneath the floorboards, illuminating a steep, narrow staircase made of riveted steel. It didn't look like a cellar. It looked like the entrance to a submarine. The air wafting up from the depths wasn't stale. It was shockingly dry and carried the faint metallic scent of ozone and preserved machinery. "Mommy?" Leandro whimpered, his small hand gripping the fabric of her coat so tightly his knuckles were white. "Is it a basement?" "I think so, sweetheart," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay right behind me. Hold on to my belt." She stepped onto the first metal grate. It held firm, emitting a solid, reassuring sound. They descended slowly, the temperature dropping with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, Mary's flashlight revealed a heavy, military-grade blast door. It was painted olive drab, and right in the center, stenciled in faded white paint, were the words, "Department of War. Authorized personnel only." Beside the door was a heavy mechanical lever. Mary handed the flashlight to Leandro, instructed him to point it at the handle, and grabbed the lever with both hands. She threw her entire body weight backward. With a grinding screech of metal against metal, the internal deadbolts retracted. The heavy door swung open on perfectly balanced hinges. Mary gasped. She reached inside, feeling along the wall, and her fingers brushed against a heavy ceramic switch. She flipped it. To her absolute shock, A series of caged industrial incandescent bulbs flickered to life, bathing the cavernous room in a warm amber glow. Harrison Collins had wired the bunker to a subterranean geothermal turbine, utilizing the mountain's natural hot springs. The engineering was decades ahead of its time. The room was massive, easily the footprint of the entire cabin above. But it wasn't a laboratory, as she had briefly imagined. It was an archive. Rows of steel filing cabinets lined the concrete walls. In the center of the room sat a massive mahogany conference table piled high with leather-bound ledgers, maps, and stacks of documents preserved under heavy glass paperweights. Along the far wall were a dozen wooden shipping crates, each secured with iron bands. Mary walked toward the table, completely mesmerized. She picked up a heavy, leather-bound ledger. The gold-leaf lettering on the spine read, Operation Safe Haven, Unredacted Financial Audits, 1944 to 1947. Because of her background as a paralegal, Mary knew how to read financial documents. As she flipped through the yellowed pages, her eyes widened in horror and realization. These weren't just wartime accounts. They were meticulously documented proof of high treason. Her grandfather hadn't just been an engineer, he was an elite forensic auditor, contracted by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and Director William Donovan. Harrison had been tasked with tracking illicit financial flows during the collapse of the Third Reich. But the ledger showed that Harrison had discovered something far more sinister than Nazi smuggling. He had uncovered a massive, coordinated effort by powerful American industrial magnates and politicians to launder stolen European gold and seized patents through neutral Swiss accounts, absorbing the wealth into their own private corporations. The ledger named real, historically untouchable names, highly placed officials in the State Department, prominent figures like Allen Dulles, and the heads of massive steel and banking conglomerates who had publicly supported the war effort while privately profiting from the enemy. He found out, Mary whispered to herself, the weight of the paper heavy in her hands. He found the paper trail, and they found out he knew. She moved to the wooden crates along the wall. The first one had been pried open, the lid resting loosely on top. She pushed it aside. The crate was packed to the brim with neatly stacked, wax paper-wrapped bundles. Mary tore the corner of one bundle. Her breath caught in her throat. They were Swiss bearer bonds, denominations of 100,000 francs each, and there were hundreds of them. Bearer bonds functioned like cash. Whoever physically held the paper owned the money. They were unregistered, untraceable, and utterly immune to the passage of time. The sheer volume of paper in the crate represented tens of millions of dollars. There were 11 more crates just like it. Harrison hadn't just stolen the blackmail material to protect himself. He had intercepted the illicit payouts. He had hidden the stolen wealth of a corrupt shadow empire right beneath their noses, leaving it sealed until the people who hunted him were dead, and the statute of limitations on the financial crimes had long expired. Suddenly, a sound shattered the absolute silence of the mountain. It was faint, muffled by the earth and the heavy timber of the cabin above, but distinct. The deep, guttural crunch of heavy tires rolling over frozen gravel. Multiple vehicles. Mary's blood turned to ice water. She scrambled up the metal stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, and peeked through a crack in the iron shutters of the cabin's living room window. 3 black, unmarked SUVs had just pulled into the snowy clearing. The doors opened, and 6 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark tactical gear, carrying suppressed rifles. From the lead vehicle stepped a man Mary instantly recognized. It was Kenneth Bronson. He wasn't wearing his gentle, weary investigator expression anymore. His face was cold, calculating, and ruthless. "Oh, God," Mary choked out, scrambling back from the window. The realization hit her with sickening clarity. Gallagher and Cohen wasn't protecting her grandfather's trust. The shadow network Harrison had run from still existed, passed down through corporate boards and private wealth funds. They never knew where the cabin was, or they couldn't breach its heavily trapped, explosive-rigged outer perimeter without the original iron key, a key the trust legally required to be given only to the bloodline heir. They had needed Mary to open the door. They had used her desperation, her homelessness, and her son's illness as a tool to unlock the vault. And now that she had led them to it, she and Leandro were loose ends. "Leandro, come here, right now," Mary commanded, her voice dropping to a fierce, urgent whisper. She practically pulled him down the metal staircase, slamming the trapdoor shut above them and throwing the heavy steel deadbolts on the bunker's blast door. "Mummy, who are those men?" Leandro asked, tears finally spilling over his pale cheeks. "They are bad men who want what your great-grandfather left us," Mary said, dropping to her knees and gripping his shoulders. "But I am not going to let them take it, and I am not going to let them hurt you. Do you understand?" Leandro nodded silently, burying his face in her neck. Mary stood up, her mind racing. The bunker was a fortress, but it was also a tomb. They had no food, no water, and eventually Bronson's men would blow the blast door. She needed leverage. She needed a weapon. She ran back to the mahogany desk and began tearing through Harrison's blueprints and personal journals. "Think, Mary. You're a paralegal. You know how to negotiate. But you can't negotiate without power." She flipped to the final page of Harrison's black journal. There was a crude schematic of the bunker's power routing, accompanied by a single, underlined sentence. "The truth is a fire. Let it burn if you must." Mary followed the schematic to a heavy iron control box mounted on the far wall near the geothermal turbine intake. Inside the box were 2 dials and a heavy red lever. The schematic indicated that pulling the lever would disengage the pressure valves on the turbine, causing a catastrophic steam explosion that would incinerate the bunker, the documents, and the cabin above it in a matter of minutes. It was Harrison's final failsafe to ensure the cabal never got their money back if the bunker was compromised. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from above. They had breached the cabin's front door. Heavy footsteps thundered across the floorboards. A moment later, a loud metallic banging struck the outside of the bunker's blast door. "Mary!" Bronson's voice echoed through the thick steel, amplified by a megaphone. "I know you can hear me. Listen to me very carefully. You are in over your head. The money down there, the documents, they do not belong to you. They belong to a coalition of very powerful interests." Mary walked to the heavy door. She found a small, reinforced speaking tube built into the concrete wall, another of Harrison's paranoid, brilliant additions. She uncapped it. "You used my son to get in here," she screamed into the tube, her voice shaking with rage. "It was a necessary deception," Bronson's voice floated back, sounding distorted but calm. "We've waited 75 years for this. We bought Gallagher and Cohen 20 years ago, just to monitor the trust. We couldn't bypass your grandfather's biometric and mechanical locks without the key and your physical presence. But your part in this is over. Open the door, walk away, and I will wire $5 million into an offshore account in your name. You and your son can disappear, wealthy and safe." "You're lying," Mary spat. "You can't afford to leave us alive. We've seen the ledgers. We know about the treason, the laundering, Operation Safe Haven." A brief, tense silence hung in the air. When Bronson spoke again, his voice had lost all its warmth. "If you do not open this door in 60 seconds, we will place a shaped C4 charge on the hinges. The concussive force inside that sealed bunker will rupture your eardrums and likely kill the boy. Do not be foolish, Mary." Mary's eyes darted around the room. She looked at the lever. She looked at the bearer bonds. Then she looked at the heavy canvas bag she had brought from the car, containing her few personal belongings, including her cheap, prepaid smartphone. There was no cell service in the mountains, but she didn't need cell service to take a picture. "Leandro, bring me my phone," she ordered. She ran to the table, spread open the most damning ledger, and began snapping high-resolution photos of the pages. She photographed signatures from Alan Dulles. She photographed the routing numbers of the Swiss accounts. She photographed the exact serial numbers of the bearer bonds in the crates. She ran back to the speaking tube. "Bronson," she yelled. "Time is up, Ms. Foster. Stand clear of the door." "Listen to me," she roared, tapping into a well of primal, maternal fury she didn't know she possessed. "I have my grandfather's dead man switch engaged. If you blow this door, the concussive force will trigger a geothermal pressure cascade. The entire bunker will vaporize. The bonds, the ledgers, everything your bosses have waited 75 years for will be turned to ash. You'll have nothing but a smoking crater to show your employers." The sound of drilling outside stopped. "She's bluffing," she heard a muffled voice say through the tube. "I'm a paralegal, Bronson," Mary lied smoothly, keeping her voice incredibly steady. "I know how evidence works, and I know how leverage works. I am standing next to a manual override for the hot springs turbine. You can hear the hum of the generator through the door. I will pull this lever before that C4 detonates. But that's not all." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I just took 75 high-definition photographs of the ledgers, the signatures, and the bearer bonds using my smartphone. If anything happens to me or my son, those photos are set to sync to a cloud server the absolute second this phone reconnects to a network. My former boss at the law firm has the password. If I don't check in by tomorrow morning, he is instructed to forward the entire file to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the New York Times." It was a total bluff. She had no internet, no scheduled send, and her former boss despised her. But Bronson didn't know that. Bronson only knew that he was dealing with the granddaughter of Harrison Collins, a man who had outsmarted the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world. Silence stretched out. Mary could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She looked at Leandro, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. "What are your terms?" Bronson finally asked. His voice was strained, the arrogant composure completely shattered. Mary felt a terrifying rush of adrenaline. She had them. "You and your men leave the property right now," Mary demanded. "You leave the SUVs at the bottom of the logging road and you walk back to the highway. Once I am sure you are gone, I will take 1 crate of the bearer bonds. Just 1. That's roughly $5 million. You can have the rest. You can have the ledgers. You can protect your precious employers. But if I ever see you, or anyone from Gallagher & Cohen again, I will ruin your entire shadow empire. Do we have a deal?" Bronson didn't answer immediately. He was doing the math. Losing $5 million was a drop in the bucket compared to the total cash. But losing the ledgers to the press would mean catastrophic federal indictments and the dismantling of billions in generational wealth. "Agreed," Bronson said. His voice was venomous. "You take 1 crate. We will wait at the bottom of the mountain. Do not test us, Mary." "Walk," she commanded. She listened through the tube. She heard the distinct sounds of heavy boots retreating across the floorboards above. She heard the ruined front door groan open and shut. She sprinted up the stairs and peeked through the iron shutters just in time to see the men walking down the snowy road on foot, leaving the SUVs behind, exactly as she had ordered. Mary collapsed against the cold iron wall of the bunker, her legs finally giving out. She pulled Leandro into her arms, burying her face in his hair, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears weren't just from terror. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. It took her 3 hours to pack the trunk of one of the abandoned SUVs with their belongings, blankets, and a single wooden crate of perfectly preserved, untraceable Swiss bearer bonds. She left the bunker open, the ledgers sitting exactly where they were, waiting for Bronson's men to return and claim their hollow victory. Mary didn't care about exposing the sins of dead men. She only cared about her son. As she put the heavy SUV into gear and drove down the mountain, leaving the 1998 Honda Civic and the nightmare of the last 2 years behind forever, the sun finally broke through the heavy winter clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the snow-covered pines. Mary's story is a testament to the fact that true inheritance isn't just about wealth, it's about the resilience passed down through our blood. She secured a private attorney, liquidated the bonds in Geneva, and bought a beautiful, secure home in the Pacific Northwest. Today, Leandro breathes easy in the fresh mountain air, and they never looked back at the cold darkness of their past. Would you like me to analyze the historical context of Operation Safe Haven and how post-World War II financial laundering actually occurred in real life?